Welcome everyone to the Cafe Speaker Series. The Cafe stands for the Center for Archival Futures. We are a relatively new iSchool center. We started up in January of this year. We are a group of interdisciplinary researchers from the iSchool and beyond whose work intersects at archives and digital curation, but incredibly broadly conceived. Generally speaking, we are interested in systems, processes, and the institutions that care for and enable the use of digital objects and data over time. The various projects that fall under CAFE's umbrella take a wide range of human-centered approaches to understanding topics, including data in communities, knowledge ecosystems, as well as the life cycles of data. This speaker series is our flagship event. We hold it on the first week of every month during the semester, and we host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation, research, and practices in a wide variety of institutions. You can find recordings of our previous illustrious guest speakers at the link that someone will put into the chat, probably Katrina. We have had, I think this is our third lecture, so we have at least two more that you can watch when you're done hanging out with us today. Today's talk is co-sponsored by StratLab. StratLab is the research lab that I run with my graduate students, some of which are here today. StratLab stands for Socio-Technical Research and Teaching Lab, and we provide a intellectual space and support environment for graduate students, as well as other faculty members who are interested in STS, socio-technical work, and reading people like Kittler and Franz Fanon and other theorists in our spare time. So if you are a member of the UMD community and you are a member of the iSchool community specifically, and you would like to join us in this month we're reading Stuart Hall all the time. That is the theme of our book club this semester. You can definitely talk to me after the lecture, or you can email me and I will make sure you are on our Discord, which is where we primarily live in these COVID times. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Sherri Wasserman constructs experiences at the intersections of physical, multimedia, and informational landscapes. She makes things for print, digital, and architectural environmental spaces, creating content-rich exhibitions, installations, books, websites, and mobile apps for wide-ranging audiences. Her clients have included the National 9/11 Memorial Museum, the MIT Museum, the American Folk Art Museum, the Gapminder Foundation, Biosphere 2, Todo Mundo and David Byrne, NYU Abu Dhabi, as well as the Smithsonian. She was a member of the inaugural Experimental Research Design Lab team at Autodesk's Pier 9, an artist in residence at the Prelinger Library, and a Santa Fe Art Institute resident artist. She maintains an ongoing affiliation with the Maddow Lab at Harvard University. Wasserman has received Bachelor of Arts in Visual Arts and History from Oberlin College and a master's degree from the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU at the Tisch School of Art. And she is currently pursuing a Ph.D. within ASU's Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology program. We are super excited to have her here and very excited for her talk. So I'm just going to hand it over to Sherri.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, great. So, hello and good day. I'd first like to thank Dr. Sauter for asking me to contribute to the discussions amongst this incredible group of people who've been a part of the Cafe series, and to be the first Archives Future speaker co-sponsored by their lab. I'm honored to be here and thank you all for attending. This talk brings together three different background positions that I'm coming from: my ongoing varied work with archives, my professional background, and my dissertation research as a PhD candidate in a program that falls under the general domain of science and technology and society, or science and technology studies, depending on how you translate the acronym STS. I began working in archives as an undergraduate. I had processed a congressional member's professional documents, and I also learned how to read architecture plans from archivists as I assisted on cataloging the college's architectural collection. After college, I spent 3.5 years overseeing and participating, processing the personal and professional collections of architect Bertrand Goldberg, the guy who did many, many things, as well as built the famous concrete corncob towers known as Marina City in Chicago. At other points, I was an in-house archivist for a fashion and documentary photographer and began negotiations to attempt to archive a novel multi-platform cultural project based in the United Arab Emirates. Between and since these engagements, I've collaborated with archives to gain permission on items, as well as inform and feature collections as part of my career in exhibition, public space design. I've also been working on a long-term documentary project about games preservation archives, and now I'm both a longtime archives fan and spending considerable time studying materials within archives towards my dissertation research. I've been a designer of public experiences for more than 2 decades through a wide range of scales and mediums on an even wider range of topics. Throughout this talk, I'll reference a lot of authors, scholars, and guides. Although I've not footnoted this talk visibly and I don't specifically cite every definition and idea, I subscribe to the belief that citation practices are political. I've attempted to cite things fairly without bogging the entire talk down. This talk also sources stories from my ongoing research, which is all very much still a work in progress. So for both those and my provocations, I acknowledge that I'm very much thinking this through in public. Because of all that, I've also chosen to not include imagery and information for which I don't have specific permission yet. Today, I'm going to address my talk abstract as a set of questions. I won't have all the answers, but turning this into an inquiry rather than a manifesto positions the groundwork I'll lay here for discussion and further consideration. The first question is, how do archives, as data interfaces and institutions, support multidisciplinary interrogations that entangle systems perspectives with human stories to create complex collective notions of survivability? And secondly, how do these types of interrogations revise and expand our mental maps of how we might tackle obstacles, what our futures could hold? First, let's start with some definitions that ground why and how I'm framing these questions. Second, we'll address why these questions matter. What do I mean by survivability? The concept of survivability arises from military literature. The term refers to the assessment of human and technological systems' abilities to complete their missions within hostile conditions. Academics and industry practitioners expand use of the phrase to include similar interrogations of systems' capabilities to persist under duress. When I approach the questions of survivability, I take inspiration from mainstream journalistic storytelling, but bolster anecdotal survival narratives with STS understandings. I look to gain insights from a multidisciplinary review of academic and popular literature, alongside archival and ethnographic research, to generate new data and analysis to arrive at a multidimensional mapping of survivability. The work of journalists and popular writers provides us with anecdotal models for survivability in the face of sociocultural environmental disasters. Authors such as Philip Gravich and Rebecca Solnit narrate individual and community hero leadership stories where ordinary people respond to extraordinary things in humane ways that allow for collective perseverance. Annalee Newitz and Alan Wiseman extend these types of narratives into longer time frames by providing insights from societal challenges of the deep past and speculating about our current detrimental impacts on our future environments. Writing from within the danger, Ed Young and Masha Gessen look for explanations of systemic collapse, as shown within Young's documentation of American governmental failures in the COVID-19 pandemic, and Gessen's ongoing analyses of Russian politics and the global rise of authoritarianism. Within survival narratives, as with all narratives, the positionality of perspectives matter. Whereas anthropologist Joseph Mascow documents the culture of Los Alamos National Labs as a long study of national notions of survivability from the perspective of a knowledgeable outsider, Solnit addresses the multifaceted impacts of the nuclear industrial complex from her stance as a longtime anti-nuclear activist. Journalist Randy Schultz was considered a premier ethnographer of the AIDS crisis within the moment, but David France and Sarah Schulman have since written documentary accounts from their perspectives as epidemic frontline ACT UP activists. However, more multifaceted visions provided by collective accumulation of interior and exterior accounts often don't include both large-scale structural analyses and the ways in which details play into the systems. In contrast, Stephen Epstein's STS work on ACT UP's navigation of credibility and expertise provides concrete insights into both ACT UP's actions and larger health regulation system dynamics, while the work of performance studies scholar Deborah Levine describes the underlying ethical networks and sincere performances of palliative care that emerge between individual ACT-UP members. In thinking about the roles that archives may play in future thinking, I see the possibilities to leverage strengths of journalistic popular narratives alongside teachings provided by structural, focused analyses of scholars from multiple disciplines to entangle systems perspectives with human stories to create complex comprehensions of how we collectively shape our notions of survivability. I want to be specific about what I mean by complex, because I arise at this concept from studying complex adaptive system science, and I approach it from a few primary perspectives. In addition to thinking about questions of resilience and robustness and how component parts interact, support, are both interdependent and independent from one another, I'm influenced by Charles Perrow's work, as summarized in his book, Normal Accidents. He proposes that any sufficiently complex system cannot completely be understood, but it can be envisioned enough to navigate to some extent. The work of Adrian Murray Brown provides a different perspective. As a social movement organizer, Brown describes complex systems as the entangled pieces of people, systems, and society. And she does so in a way that always makes me think of the word muck, something with varying clarity in which we might sit and through which we might walk. Her negotiation of complex systems, as I understand it, is to iterate towards clarity. Or, as a huge Samuel Beckett fan, I think of Brown's approach as a deeply intersectional version of Try Again Tomorrow. Whereas the underpinnings of complex system science describe complexity in terms of component parts, Perrow addresses what many of us would refer to as humans' intersections with socio-technical systems. And Brown brings in a messy human aspect to complex systems thinking. And today we'll enter into these questions through stories of people as parts of systems, stories about individuals, subaltern communities, and more expansive open mainstream communities, both in terms of the stories and the ways in which I discovered them. Before we move to the stories, let's stop and address the second question. How do these types of interrogations revise and expand our mental maps of how we might tackle obstacles and what our futures could hold? Inferred in this question is a notion of where in time archives sit. Archives, while caretakers of the past, are always about the future, because a remit for preservation is a remit for future survival. A question I want to plant as a seed today is what if and how might archives become more actively involved in the ways we collectively imagine the future? Before we return to notions of the future, let me clarify what I mean by imagine and imaginations as a part of future thinking. Setting this definition now will frame the specific stories I choose to talk about today. So imagination can be a very gauzy term that infers creativity and cognitive manifestations, and this is relevant to our interests. But let's also employ STS perspectives to this in acknowledging broad social imaginations and imaginaries. I frame my own understandings of collectively constructed imaginations and imaginaries in three primary ways that build upon one another. First, Taylor explains that broad social imaginaries are constructed through the great connected chain of mutations of the public sphere, a market economy, and the citizen state. All three intersect and evolve to create social conditions through which citizens imagine, invest in collective civic goals, projects, and commitments. Second, Marcus more specifically addresses technoscientific imaginaries as conceptions that arise from interactions between individuals, scientific systems, public perceptions of the utility and risks of scientific, technological developments, governmental structures, and narratives about science, scientists, and the state. Third, it's also worthwhile to consider the additional specificity of socio-technical imaginations as defined by Jasanoff and Kim. They refer to these imaginaries as conceptions of scientific technological breakthroughs within society that are almost always imbued with implicit understandings of what is good or desirable in the social world writ large. Socio-technical imaginaries are collectively imagined forms, social life and social order, reflected in the design and fulfillment of nation-specific scientific and/or technological projects. Jasanoff and Kim also argue that socio-technical imaginaries are articulate, feasible futures. So why does the futures part of this question matter? Practicing the future outside of the specificity of any particular design or foresight methodology means deliberately navigating uncertainty in the present, as well as imagining possible, not just probable futures. Acknowledging and navigating uncertainty are survival skills for individuals, organizations, and communities, and deliberately developing their use of uncertainty within the context of practicing the future allows them to revise and expand their mental maps, how they might tackle obstacles and what their futures could hold. According to cognitive psychologists, humans each develop and maintain internal databases of mental maps of our past, present, and potential futures. When individuals revise and add to the data records, they expand both their comprehensions and their expectations. Individual and collective expectations always include evaluative data and values. However, future study scholars explain, if individuals, organizations, and communities consider the future to be something that can be transformed, they engage with and embed additional values into these expectations. The future is not fixed, even overly predetermined, or something to be filled. The future may be seen as open, and individuals, organizations, and communities have agency to impact what the future may become. Let's stop for a moment and define archives in a particular way for the purposes of our discussion. I refer to three things: data, interface, and institution. At its simplest, we could say that this means that archives are the stories they hold, the ways in which we access these stories, and how the information we access is framed within larger sociocultural contexts. As we acknowledge archives through these three lenses, I want to lay the groundwork now for some questions we're going to return to at the end. I want to pose some possibilities for an expansive vision of what archives may be by introducing you to four of my favorite informal institutions that employ practices that overlap with more formal archives while still maintaining configurations of data, interface, and institution. Volunteers, mostly, if not all, military veterans, established the Alameda Naval Air Museum after the Alameda, California Naval Air Base closed in 1997. Collections gathered from veterans, exhibited in a former base building staffed by veterans, tell stories of military involvement from World War II through Desert Storm. The choices and staging of artifacts are unexpected and expansive in their details, including acknowledgement of the involvement of women and people of color in ways I haven't seen in more official institutions. The day I visited, my friend and I were given an impromptu, spontaneously responsive tour by one of the elder veterans manning the ticket desk. He provided colorful commentary in addition to the already very personal, idiosyncratic signage and label interpretation. Second, many of you may know the incredible preservation, knowledge, and community work of the unparalleled Rick and Megan Prelinger. With a collection fashioned around their wide range of interests and organized with an underlying structure that reflects the long history of their relationship, their specificity expands the multifaceted relevance and use of their collection through their deep Bay Area and beyond community ties and their generosity of collaboration to anyone who may intersect their public intellectual practices in a respectful way. Third, I suspect, though I admittedly have not asked him recently, that Nick Montfort may or may not consider the trope tank housed in his office at MIT as an archive, but I find it to be an interesting structural configuration. He activates his extensive collection of machines, software, and associated materials as means through which to teach experimental narrative. And as a multi-platform computational poet himself, one who creates visual art using Commodore 64s, his perspectives on time and preservation are ones I always find fascinating. And fourth, the Learning Games Initiative, whose base is located in Tucson, Arizona, is a self-described most gonzo of archives. I understand them as a living archive that operates as a working garage. Something breaks and they fix it with a spare part from another. The co-founders, Ken McAllister and Judd Gill, would agree with my categorization. We've talked about it, but they'd also make sure to know that they can operate in the ways they do, in part because other white-gloved games archives exist. Their materials, hardware, software, and contextual artifacts can be borrowed by anyone from professors to primary school children, anyone who's doing research of any type located near or far. Pre-pandemic, they also kept a fridge full of beverages to serve visiting explorers. One of their most delightful user types were grandparents who'd stop by to learn about and play video games so that they could have more things to talk about with their grandchildren. Now that I've provided the groundwork of definitions and frameworks for these questions, I'll provide 3 examples that exemplify the kinds of stories I mentioned, how archives intersect in my discovery of these examples, and how these examples make me wonder about the roles archives can play in imagining collective futures. Also, I've entered this talk with feedback that some of you are here to learn about Georgio O'Keefe's fallout shelter. So let's get to it. My research about Georgio O'Keefe's building of a nuclear fallout shelter at her home in New Mexico is a previously undocumented historical study grounded in archival research. I approach O'Keefe's construction of the shelter as a doorway into the artist's autodidactic studies of science, her relationships and collaborations with science and scientists, and how these relationships may have informed her work, her worldview, and her decision to build defensive architecture. Within my research, I explore O'Keefe's story as a means to envision a national project of survival in mid-20th century America, conceptions of survival when faced with risk tied to emerging technologies, and how these two things may have played into O'Keefe's notions of time survivability in the future. I immediately have a lot to say about contextualizing O'Keefe's fallout shelter into these larger questions about her place as an American citizen within society and her entanglements with science and scientists. So we'll keep it top level, and I'm open to questions from those who are particularly interested. Georgio O'Keeffe was both a renowned painter and a singular individual situated at the nexus of artistic, intellectual, and cultural milieus. Her artistic credibility and celebrity also provided her with access to information and resources rare for a woman of her time, while amplifying her status as an aspirational representation of what women, particularly smart, accomplished, wholly independent women, could achieve. In approximately 1962, O'Keeffe constructed a nuclear fallout shelter at her home and studio in Abacu, New Mexico. The knowledge she gained that informed both her decision to create the fallout shelter and how to build it were a result of her social and cultural standing, but they were also an indication that the perceived boundaries of her expertise, as reinforced by academic literatures, may be flawed. O'Keeffe is widely considered an exquisite painter on a technical level, and that her use of materials has been studied and emulated long past her time. She gained that competency through education and rigorous practice, to a degree which is rarely taught today. Before gaining international respect as an exhibiting artist, O'Keeffe supported herself primarily through teaching. As both a painter and an instructor, she comprehended and communicated art as a combination of expression and chemistry. Given O'Keeffe's background, chemist and conservator Caroline Keck would not have found it surprising when her ongoing dialogue, found within 40 years of letters with O'Keeffe, turned technical. O'Keeffe painted with highly controlled purpose. It was through increasing scientific knowledge that she gained control over her art. Keck is not the first or only scientist with whom O'Keeffe collaborated. She assisted Alfred Stieglitz within his photographic darkroom. It was an art form generally acknowledged to be as technical chemical science as much as a means of expression. Louis Mumford was a known member of Stieglitz and O'Keeffe's intellectual circle, and she would have intersected with his perspectives on materiality and socio-technical systems. O'Keeffe also maintained long-term friendships with Los Alamos nuclear physicists, such as Dr. Louis Rosen. O'Keeffe's building of fallout shelters is an example of a mid-20th century socio-technical imagination meeting American notions of survivability. My research examines where science and the national projects within which it was pursued meets a resourced, autodidactic member of the public. In doing so, this research provides new insights into mid-century ideas of survival, while also reconsidering what we know about O'Keeffe. I first learned of the existence of Georgio O'Keeffe's nuclear fallout shelter in the spring of 2019. I was temporarily residing in Santa Fe as part of a Truth and Reconciliation art residency, where I was working on a long-term personal project of the institutionalized and untold stories about the history of the nuclear industrial complex in America. An old museum sector friend and head of conservation for the O'Keeffe Museum, Dale Cronkright, who's really one of the most brilliant and generous people you could ever meet, invited me to the institution for a visit. Here's where I'll admit that I went because I'm a huge fan of Dale's. I have always admired the craftsmanship of O'Keeffe's work, but I also found her to be overexposed. Dale's take on O'Keeffe, though, was always something to behold. When Dale found out why I was in Santa Fe and what I was working on, he mentioned the fallout shelter. He may have called it a shelter or a bunker. I think at the time I might have excitedly then referred to it as a bunker, but the two aren't the same. I'll return to that in a minute. It exists, Dale told me, and I can probably get you in to see it. We know very little about it. Pre-2019, almost no research had been done on the fallout shelter. At the moment I learned of its existence, an architectural historian named Dr. Sarah Roving was performing the first known investigations into when it may have been built and why. Her research was based in documents in the O'Keeffe archive in Santa Fe, contextual information in archives and libraries in northern New Mexico, and research she performed at the Beinecke collection at Yale. Dr. Roving's not yet published research is fantastic, provides strong grounding for the approximate date of construction, 1962, as well as context for who and why people were building nuclear fallout shelters in early 1960s America. The term fallout shelter is one of multiple terms used for variations on similar forms of fortification structures. Fallout shelters belong to structural types of what Paul Virilio terms defensive architecture, buildings that he describes as instrumental, existing less in themselves than with a view to doing something, waiting, watching, then acting, or rather reacting. I use the phrase fallout shelter because it's the primary term Dr. Roving's research report, historical documents, and the Georgio O'Keefe Museum, the owners and caretakers of the Abiquiu property, used to describe the structure. In addition, in her report, Dr. Roving explains that shelters like O'Keefe's were meant not to provide any significant defense against the actual heat and explosive power of the atomic bomb, but to protect the occupants from the subsequent radiation exposure following a strike that happened at some survivable distance away. She states that there is therefore more accurate to refer to the structure as a fallout shelter rather than as a bomb shelter or bunker. Though I love architecture and architectural history, as I mentioned earlier, I originally learned to read architectural plans from archivists. I decided instead, though, to take a deliberately STS approach to inquiring about the shelter construction. This came in part from where my head was in my studies, and also from another seed that Dale dropped in conversation that I just couldn't get out of my head. Dale mentioned that O'Keefe destroyed a significant amount of her paintings because they aged in ways in which she was unsatisfied. The combination of the shelter and the painting's destruction anecdote caused me to question more broadly how O'Keefe may have imagined survivability. Something I've learned throughout my professional and personal work is that you need to just keep showing up. Showing up indicates that you're serious, that you're doing your homework, and you're willing to put in the time to demonstrate respect. For more than a year, I returned to New Mexico every few weeks. Each time I wrote Dale and asked about gaining access to visit and photograph the fallout shelter. And each time I used it as an excuse to start exploring the O'Keefe archives and then also have lunch or coffee with him. I used these explorations to tell him what I was looking for, what I was finding, and what I was starting to ask next. Those conversations continually open and continue to open questions that were at the crux of Dale's scientific worldview of O'Keefe, my knowledge and interest in the military-industrial complex, my burgeoning perspectives as a STS researcher, and the fallout shelter. However, the fallout shelter itself quickly became a way into something much larger. All these reasons that I'd been, let's say, under-enthusiastic about O'Keefe were what I increasingly found so valuable. O'Keefe is extraordinary, but not intimidating. She's exemplary and ironically was known to be irascible at times, but she's friendly. Can O'Keefe and her choices to build the nuclear fallout shelter become a low barrier to entry way into talking about much more difficult conversations about thinking about survival in the future? Come for O'Keefe, stay for the insights about making it through tomorrow? I've since gained access to the photograph the fallout shelter, had informal discussions with multiple people who have relationships to and maintain her home and studio. And I've spent dozens of hours with the archives following threads about not only the shelter, but her relationships to science and scientists. To date, the vast majority of O'Keefe's scholarship written with any scientific lens are Dale's chapters and articles about her materials and conservation. But the evidence that this whole dark corner of her life exists. For instance, this is an excerpt from Los Alamos scientist Louis Rosen's contribution to the Georgio O'Keefe Oral History Project, talking about how they would discuss nuclear physics and related socio-technical implications over dinner. I understand why the stories about O'Keefe's relationship to scientists have remained in the shadows. During her lifetime, these stories fit neither Stieglitz's public fashioning of her persona or her own post-Stieglitz narratives about herself. Also, the majority of scholars who concern themselves with O'Keefe are art historians, and art historians aren't trained to ask the kinds of questions that I'm asking. But asking different questions to multifaceted, robust collections, such as the one within the O'Keefe archives, allows us to both rethink and use the past to imagine and discuss the future. Within this anecdote, there's something in there about how we might conceive of our data differently. But I say that with acknowledgement that I would not have even thought to question the archives in this unusual way if I hadn't had a different kind of interface, a very knowledgeable guide who provided wayfinding without any sense of what kinds of corridors I'd imagine. The AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power was formed in the late 80s as a community response to the AIDS epidemic. The group was particularly visibly known for their street protests and their incredible efforts and execution to humanize and make visible the crisis to larger publics while fighting for rights and pushing for proper health care. In the midst of this, subsections of the organization taught themselves about treatments, the science behind them, and the rhetoric to use within institutional settings. They navigated sanctioned drug trials as well as held their own and fundamentally transformed the pharmaceutical system and patients' place within it in the United States. The work on this front that was documented and analyzed within the research of STS scholar Stephen Epstein. As I mentioned before, his work provides a structural lens to ACT UP's work within the American socio-technical health systems in ways that elucidate inspiration that was then garnered by other health activist communities, such as those who have fought for transformed rights for breast cancer patients. However, as I also mentioned before, his structural work named people provides some human aspects to the engagement of systems, but that's not its strength. Epstein fundamentally tells a story of ACT UP's efforts and who can gain it. And you can gain additional community color by reading the accounts of multiple ACT UP members, some of whom were deeply involved in the drug trial transformations. All of these accounts are complex, charismatic stories that are both inspirational and hold their own situated politics within their bounds. And possibly because of these politics, a key detail again has been primarily left out. I personally think that if you leave out this detail, you've lost a key component in comprehending and possibly replicating this configuration of survivability. Dr. Iris Long, who Jim Igoe here describes as a queen's housewife, was at the time a middle-aged white woman who played a crucial role in ACT UP's involvement in the drug trials. Epstein mentions her in one sentence, noting her as an ACT UP member who had a scientific background. David France brings her into multiple paragraphs as someone involved with collecting and parsing the trial data. In Sarah Schulman's latest book, you'll encounter her more, mostly because her involvement appears in the oral histories from which the book is created. In her own oral history, Dr. Long both plays down her involvement, and her interviewer doesn't really ask questions that would elucidate her role. However, Jim Igoe both confirms her essential role and hints at why and the ways in which she may have been left behind subsequent accounts, including the fact that she's a cis hetero woman and a heavily, though not definitely and exclusively, gay male organization. She too explains that she shouldn't have been the face of the work. She's also, and I've heard this directly from an ACT UP member, a brilliant woman who is a notoriously bad communicator. Igoe beautifully narrates how their partnership came to be, how he became her outward-facing communicator, and how their partnership manifested and supported one another throughout the literal and metaphorical trials. On one hand, you might start to notice this pattern of me finding historical holes through archives. On the others, we can use this as an opportunity for acknowledging that no data is neutral, and there are contexts to the historical stories we tell. One of the things I really love about finding Igoe's account as a definitive piece of evidence of her centrality is that it explains to me that I'm not just discovering a story about her, I'm discovering stories about their relationship and work together. I wouldn't have known about Dr. Long if it wasn't for Dr. Deborah Levine, a performance scholar and former ACT UP member. I was talking to her about my research with the COVID tracking project and where I was seeing them both as a legacy and different variation on ACT UP seminal actors. And I don't remember exactly what she said about Dr. Long at the time, but I have a post-it with her name scratched on it as a result. It's with Deb's work that I want to address archives as interfaces, not just ways in which things come to light and get lost, but also how archives may be living archives in some way. In 2008, as a part of her own dissertation research, Deborah Levine watched more than 100 videos that comprised the ACT UP Oral History Archive. I first imagined this as a ritual of both research and remembrance. That wasn't actually the point. The project was about the living. As noted on her website, she watched videos for 12 hours a day, every day, until she completed the cycle. She invited not only the general public, but also reached out to her former ACT UP members to join her. As she explained to me, these testimony watch sessions fell into 3 to 4 configurations. She watched videos alone, she watched videos with the subjects, people would arrive, sometimes with supporting materials, and they'd annotate the recorded history together, filling in holes, asking questions, and talking about the experience of being interviewed. She watched the videos of people who weren't the subjects, which would again cause multiple topics to arise. And she once was so moved by what she was watching that she wrote a long email to the person in the midst of watching their oral history. This process, which could have been a litany for all they lost, was a catalyst for the living. not just to commemorate and commiserate, but instead to reconnect after a traumatic time and troublesome dissolution of the organization. The archives became a focus through which to feel and talk and share and plot paths forward together after what Deb explained was a considerable absence of communication between many of them. And in this, I see another possibility for archives' roles in future imaginations. Archive as interface can mean so many things, from data organization to curation to events like these. What Dr. Levine's stage was so specific. Can something like that really scale? I don't know, but it helps me wonder about possibilities. It also reminds me to continue to ask something about how past, present, and future and/or data and bodies intertwine. The COVID tracking project, which I'm going to hereafter refer to as CTP, was a geographically distributed networked effort to gather and analyze pandemic data in the face of socio-technical failure. 4 co-founders, 2 journalists, a data scientist, and a content strategist, began CTP in March 2020 to acquire pandemic-related information that was not offered or easily accessed through US state and federal agencies. Initially meant as a stopgap measure until governmental data became more accessible, reliable, and comprehensible, the project evolved and expanded into a massive, mostly volunteer-powered civic technoscience initiative that persisted for the entire first year of the pandemic. Variably skilled team members taught themselves, each other, media outlets, governmental agencies, and wider publics how to comprehend evolving COVID-19 knowledge, parse multiple types of data, and utilize technological tools that they built and iterated upon to support their daily data collection efforts. From my minimal description, you may begin to get a sense of CTP as a multidisciplinary, collaborative imaginary about what our relationships to government and society may be, and as a fundamentally multidisciplinary collaboration between not just variably skilled team members, but also an incredible range of expertise. The leadership team itself included public health experts, data scientists, polished storytellers, mostly in the form of journalists, and technologists, but the specific academic and career backgrounds of both the leadership and wider initiative varied widely. And this is where a less tangible but absolutely essential aspect of what made this project work came in. From my months of observations of Slack channel communications and virtual meetings, I witnessed a form of engagement that I'd rarely, if ever, witnessed to the extent that it was forefronted at CTP. The importance of ethics and care between people inside and outside the organization, as well as for the data and communications, was absolutely essential for the team. And I would argue that it was absolutely essential for their ability to accomplish everything they did. Did they need to create a nuanced emoji library of thousands of images when so complex and embedded in the culture that even after months, I still emoji communicate at the level of a toddler? Like this morning, I stared at literally 30 different versions of the blob emoji to figure out how to react to a posting about this talk on the CTP Slack. Or did they need to celebrate each other's pets' birthdays with multi-page PDFs of birthday wishes from their own pets? Or create slide deck presentations of appreciation for one another? Or, I mean, the stories I could tell go on and on with the most incredible ways. It's possible that logistically the project may have been built without these remarkable, soft, playful, sympathetic skills, but I'm not convinced. Given the local and national situations, the team members who worked entirely online and represented many, if not most, of the 50 states, navigating uncertainty was core to the project in multiple ways. They simultaneously attempted to parse the situation of COVID data, federal and state, while trying to make sense of what COVID was and is as the scientific and public information changed, while iterating and developing their own responsive technological forms, while navigating their own individual challenges around exposure, new work, and family concerns and configurations in their own environments. They woke up each day in a strikingly evolving world, choosing the task of collecting and making sense about the data and our situations. Here's why I want to note a way in which CTP handled uncertainty differently than nearly any other trusted data source. Despite many brilliant members and a stellar level of work product, the organization's culture was one of humility. They deliberately noted aberrations in the data, questions, concerns, and reasons they found for variations. They were absolutely transparent in ways which were more traditionally institutionalized sources weren't, even if they knew that they and others were using the exact same sources to create the reports and analyses. Uncertainty wasn't just something they navigated as both people and an organization. It was a key point to their communications, and their communication of such was in part why they became such a trusted source. Their daily data collection and analysis across all states and US territories was done by people, individuals, first multiple times a day, and then later once a day, manually collected data from state websites, asked questions, sent emails, made phone calls to find missing pieces and clarify confusion. Within the data collection and quality assurance process, they also established ways to have multiple team members check the data before it went live. They worked closely with public health and science communication experts within the team to evolve their visualizations to become as clear and useful as possible, to the point where you could regularly see CTP-made charts on major news programs on a daily basis. CTP was an incredibly layered entanglement of people, information, and systems, supportive both with the ways in which the organization operated internally and how they intersected with governmental agencies and the general public. Behind the scenes throughout the project, they spoke with members of agencies, those agencies from whom we'd expect to see the work that CTP did. Their public report cards assessing the quality of state data, one aspect of how they communicated, what they were finding, and how they navigated it, was one lever to push states to improve their collection and reporting practices. Their efforts supported improvement in government data systems, and they were repeatedly called upon to present their perspectives and findings to members of government who appeared to be earnestly attempting to assess where the US government had gone wrong in its response. In their last month of operation, they held workshops about their processes, data sources, and findings, and their extensive documentation may be unprecedented for a project of that sort. This is only a tiny glimpse into what I've learned about CTP, thanks to their incredible trust and generosity in allowing me to observe them as part of my dissertation research. And here I want to return to this question of impact on imagining possibilities of future paths. On their last day of data collection in March 2021, there was a massive outpouring of appreciation, both sent to them directly and across social media and through more traditional media channels. Two of my personal favorites were by Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow. On the last day of data collection, Chris Hayes spoke for approximately 2 minutes about the importance of CTP's work to his MSNBC show's reporting. He acknowledged use of both their charts and analysis for their own ongoing comprehension of the pandemic. He also acknowledged that the project was ending in part because it should not have needed to happen in the first place. CTP arose to compensate for major governmental socio-technical failure. And though we could now see multiple ways that addressing crisis could play out, we should expect better. Either that night or the next, the new head of the CDC was interviewed on Rachel Maddow's show. In the midst of conversation about the, let's kindly say, variable pandemic response of the CDC, Maddow literally asked Dr. Walensky why the CDC couldn't be more like CTP. So I've addressed CTP as a general glimpse into their work, the relationship to systems and people, and the relations to notions of survivability. Let's now turn specifically to archives. This project's so recent, you might say, what does this have to do with archives? Well, in their typical thoughtfulness, the project leaders wrapped up the collective efforts by both finding an institutional partner, in this case, the University of California, San Francisco, and already processing through multiple essential stages of archiving the project's work. Here's where I'll admit my biases and reveal that I am a CTP archives team fangirl. My friends know that I have an idiosyncratic tendency to make imaginary t-shirts as a stress management tactic, and I did make this while multitasking during a professional client meeting, but it's one of multiple pieces of 100,000% earnest archives team fan art that I made. I've been on both sides of the archival process, organizing collections with family members and project partners towards handing them off to institutions, and also processing collections on the institutional side. And I've not encountered a process as deliberate, systematic, and ethical as what I witnessed with CTP. The Archives Working Group led discussions with the rest of the project leaders about ethical data practices and issues of participant privacy. The team knows about the t-shirt, but I actually was too sheepish to show my CTP emoji-inspired icons at the time. So admittedly, only one archives team member, who I'll keep anonymous to protect the innocent, and my incredibly generous partner in earnestness and post-data collection, CTP Community Initiative, Brandon Park, know about these illustrations I made inspired by their archiving process. Through them, you can see a glimpse into the various configurations that they thought through in terms of archiving unlocked Slack channels and public communications while ethically maintaining options for participant privacy. Throughout this process, the archives team worked with UCSF collaborators to develop new means of archiving CTP's data and communication processes, which is awesome and future-facing in its own right. However, I want to return to the 3 components I've described about archives. If a key thing we may take away from the O'Keefe story is about how we ask questions about the data, and the ACT UP example emphasizes possibilities for interface, I wonder if we might also learn something about institutions from CTP. As the least traditional form of archives of the bunch, they may possibly seem counterintuitive. But I would like to argue that CTP's ethics practices and everything from its creative culture to its archiving methods and determinations around future access may be a form of institutionality. So here's some questions that arose for me as a result of putting this set of frameworks together to begin to think through what collaborative roles archives might play in envisioning the future. What does it mean to deliberately position archives towards the future? How does this change the ways in which we think about institutionality? What are our future-facing archives interfaces if we think of them broadly conceived? How do we encourage asking different questions of the data? And how do we support variation and experimentation? In the course of this talk, I've specifically grounded this rough thinking in public inquiry that I've been doing for the last 45 minutes into archives roles and futures imaginations and theories, while also broadly telling a few stories intersected with and including archives to attempt to help us today envision ways in which data interfaces and institutions may evoke new configurations, new purposes, new roles. I'm going to end here with a statement from one of my favorite writers, Anna Leibovitz. Their work on the interrelationships between past, present, and futures, both in their nonfiction and their awesomely feminist science fiction, helps me think through timely and timeless relationships. As they write, human beings have one survival skill that we've yet to find in creatures around us. We can pass on stories of how to cope with disaster, make it easier for the next group who confronts it. As I mentioned at the beginning, I have more questions than answers, and hopefully you do as well after all of this. Thank you for your generosity of attendance here today, and I look forward to any discussions this set of provocations may cause today or in the future. Thank you.
Hooray! That was fabulous. Thank you so much for that amazing talk. At this point, I would like to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand, because I do not believe that you can unmute yourselves. So if people have questions, do raise your hand using the little ticky hand raise thing, and I will unmute you, and then we can have a conversation. Who would like to be brave and first? Don't make me cold call on people, because I will call on like Andrew. Okay, so Katrina has raised her hand. Katrina, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was hesitating to raise my hand because I'm still sort of formulating my question in my head. You've given me so much to think about, Sherri. This is wonderful. So I do research case studies of community-based archives projects and digital humanities projects. And so I loved your characterization of these various archives and of the last project in particular. It makes me think of other, responsive volunteer-based initiatives that rise up in the gaps of governmental or institutional failures to meet urgent challenges. And I'm thinking of things like, I'll put a couple links in the chat, but I'm thinking of things like the Data Refuge Initiative to archive environmental data during political administration transition, and of the Torn Apart Initiative to study the humanitarian crisis of 2018 and to capture data about ICE and their operations in the United States, their funding practices. And I think the way you've characterized this project is sort of operating on this model of ethics of care that's not often seen in institutional settings, something that I've also seen in many of the sort of thriving digital humanities and community archives projects that I've studied. But the main question that I study has to do with their sustainability. And the answer that almost always comes back around when you start talking to them about sustainability, and for archives, that's the key question: how do you maintain this, over an indefinite period of time, is always the question of how do we align these volunteer and community-driven initiatives with institutions that are amenable to their, to their ethics, to their values, and to their structures. And I'm just curious if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, that could be a whole other very long conversation that I would be happy to have with you, because I'm really obsessed with these kinds of structures, as well as, especially as somebody who spent most of the last 20 years working with official institutions. You know, I'm really moved and fascinated by community archiving and museum efforts that pre-digital especially often came out of a mistrust of large-scale governmental institutions, that they would either preserve and present their histories, or that they would do so in ways which really represent the communities. And so all of these, you know, LGBT, you know, minority communities create and keep their own archives, right? And so yes, there's this question of preservation, but there's also alternative forms of sustainability that exist in these non-digital contexts, right? And when you reach into the digital context, you have kind of two different aspects of it that come up, and this is just sort of an immediate response. And one is that it has different preservation concerns, right, than physical objects. Like, I trust you, you trust the next person. We can physically pass these things off to each other. But oftentimes in communities who would have otherwise done this kind of physical work for themselves, they may or may not have the technical expertise to have built their own platforms, to not be using third-party tools that might go away tomorrow, right, as a part of it. And so on one hand, you have a whole new risk of doing this kind of work. And on the other hand, what I've seen is much more widespread practice beyond kind of subcultural communities, where, you know, communities such as CCP will come together in ways that reflect some of the things of what might have been an LGBT community that was working very much in the shadows. And they'll do this publicly, and they'll collect this data, and it'll serve this incredible purpose. But what happens with it next, and I also think its relationship to institutionality is different than it is coming from the physical archives and museums, where it was definitely a question of trust, right? Whereas I do think that still exists in the digital domains, but I think we have a more expansive notion of projects and institutionality in the digital domain, because there's such a different social notion about how you document your life, how you put it online, what does that mean, as well as being able to come in crisis situations and compensate or overcompensate for socio-technical failures. I think one of the smartest things CTP did, which is one of the things I'm trying to learn from, and thinking about, well, what does this mean for moving forward, and how do we think about preservation with these things, is they talked to a number of organizations and a number of funders. And one of the many reasons they chose to go with UCSF was UCSF has the archives of the big investigations into big tobacco. So they knew that not only did UCSF have technical skills, they were part of a much larger infrastructure that they knew was incredibly robust. And there's an engagement with institutionality within CTP, but it's not as oppositional as it is within a lot of the more community archive projects that I've been exposed to. And so there wasn't as much of a concern about putting CTP archive into a more standard institution. There was an innovative technical knowledge, and they also, one of many reasons that they would be able to explain even more than I would is a kind of ethical alignment, as well as a contextualization, right? That somebody who knows that UCSF has the tobacco archives, you know, it makes sense that a project like CTP might also be there. And I know that they've worked very closely and collaborated with them on that. But even the fact that as the project was wrapping up, this came up as something that they knew they needed to do. And then their choices about how they did it, it really, I personally had never experienced that. And I think some of it is the character of the organization and the project. And some of it is a larger contextual shift of thinking about these sorts of things, and knowing that it's even possible. You know, I can argue that, you know, all the stories that are out there about how awesome CTP is, they're all true. They're absolutely true. But the thing I keep reacting to when I see them is I was like, oh, people even knew what was going on behind the scenes. Like they're even better, right? Like those stories. And I recognize, just as I found dark corners in other archives and other projects, that some of those stories might get lost because of the organization's ethics and choices around privacy and what is getting archived and not getting archived. I would hope to think that someone who goes into the archives who hasn't had the kind of exposure that I've been incredibly, thankful to have, will get a sense of it. But of course, some of that's going to be lost. So but at the same time, you have a lot of great writers and storytellers within the project who I think are going to be documenting those aspects of it from their situated perspectives in ways that will complement the data that's collected in the archives, which is pretty wide ranging to begin with. So that's not all of it, but that would be kind of a first blush to let's have a much longer conversation, because this sounds awesome.
Yes, please. That'd be great. I can't wait to read your dissertation. I would love to talk more about it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions from the folks who are here? We have some members of COVID tracking here, yes? You want to wave to people who were involved in the project, want to wave? Hi!
Yeah, amazing people. And Alice is actually, I don't want to put her on the spot, but she's a part of the archives team and has her own incredible relationship to both the project and libraries, archives, everything. I mean, just you can see by some of the replies, these are, I admit, like, I'm an enormous fan. And I've been having conversations recently with people about this idea that, the historian, the researcher is supposed to be like completely objective and like non-emotional about what it is. And both the people I've been talking to, and I feel like that notion of the researcher is a disservice, because it pretends like the data that is collected and the stories that are told don't have politics to them, and everyone does, right? And so I just admit, absolutely outright that I am an enormous fan of both the people in the project, and particularly the people, and I'm really thankful to have gotten to witness and experience them. And there's a last thing about that. I mean, I think what they've done in the world is absolutely going to have impacts in terms of showing us ways forward, right? Like, why can't you be more like CTP, or something like CTP can exist? But the thing that I actually am most looking forward to is the ways in which the organization operated. For many of us, when we talk to each other, it's like, many of us have never operated in organizations that operated this way. Like, really, it can be not toxic, especially those of us who have worked in tech. It's like, oh, this is an entirely different way forward. And so on top of the work itself, the thing I'm looking forward to, and I don't think it's going to be tangible, is seeing the ways in which the culture of the organization impacts the ways in which CTP people go forward in their world and how they operate. Maybe they run teams differently. Maybe they start different kinds of studios. Maybe, I think the human aspect of it is actually just as important, not only to the build of what they built, but I'm interested in seeing it as a part of the legacy.
Alice Goldfarb, you had a comment. Do you want to unmute and share your comment?
Certainly. Sherri was just talking about how, when researchers are spending time with organizations or in institutions, that's not, they will have thoughts about how those organizations are run and feelings about that. And I think, I totally agree with that, but also the places that we as researchers choose to spend time and choose to put our effort, like that is also not neutral and not arbitrary. And I just wanted to add that on to what Sherri was saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super good point. Any other questions, or this is more a comments than a questions? We can now open up the floor to those as well. Well, awesome. It's coming up on 5. Sherri, it was so lovely to have you. And everyone, Diana has dropped our next talk into the chat. Please do consider registering for that talk as well. Diana, would you like to give a little voice blurb about the talk?
Sure. So our next talk, we're collaborating with MICA, which is the Multicultural Involvement and Community Advocacy Office here. It's going to be Ashley Minner, who's an amazing Lumbee artist and scholar, and now community archivist, doing all kinds of work to collect oral histories and documentations about the Lumbee community in Baltimore. That will be a keynote. So the time is a little different, so we could facilitate the collaboration. It's going to be 6 p.m. Wednesday, November 3rd. We're hoping in tandem with some kind of pop-up exhibition, which would be really cool. It should be part of the whole month of programming that office is running for Native American Heritage Month.
Awesome. Thank you again, Sherri. Thank you all so much for coming. It was lovely to have you in our Zoom space, and we will see you next month.